You know, when it comes to bad controllers, a lot of people would argue the 64 controller is Nintendo's worst. And it's easy to see why. The stick is hard plastic that breaks easily, there's a weird slot on the back of the controller, and most importantly, it looks stupid. And while those are all valid complaints, I personally love the thing. It's incredibly comfortable to hold, the buttons feel good, the D-pad works great for the 3 games that support it, and most importantly, it looks stupid. Sure, the stick sucks, but as long as you're not tossing Bowser 20 times a day or playing Mario Party at all, it's pretty passable. But either way, it's more than a necessary evil. Without it, we likely wouldn't have joysticks in the way that we do, or at least it would have taken a few years longer for it to become a standard part of a game controller. Undeniably, no matter how bad you think it is, the Nintendo 64 controller paved the way for the future. The sideways Wiimote sucks. When the Wii originally came out, using motion to play video games was something that had never competently been done before, and tailoring an entire console around it was a risky move, that of course ended up paying off, as the Wii ended up being a resounding success, even managing to outsell the GameCube. When I first got my hands on it, like everyone else, I was absolutely enamored. Even if the games I had with it weren't the best, the Wiimote plus nunchuck combo was more than comfortable to use, and the motion controls were simply fun. As the years went on and the novelty wore off, I still found it a joy to use, simply because of how well it rested in my hands. Not to mention the pointer functionality required about as much motion as moving a mouse, and only improved the games that used it in place of stick aiming. Sure, there were games containing motion controls that were both mandatory and unnecessary, but rarely were they ever game-ruining. In cases like Mario Galaxy, I found that the shake of the Wiimote gave an extra oomph to Mario's spin that made it feel just that much better. Pressing a button to pull it off in 3D All-Stars just doesn't feel the same. And of course, the best part of the Wiimote is that, 15 years later, the stick that sits on the detachable left half of the controller doesn't drift. Though obviously the nunchuck combo was just one of many methods of using the Wiimote, but of the major 3 was the most prominently used as it actually resembled a real controller. The other most common method of using it was by detaching the nunchuck and holding it like a standard TV remote. This was most used in games focused on just pointing or waggling, as being left with only 2 buttons, the D-pad and motion controls, made it extremely limited, but it was still perfectly comfortable to use, and there were still a few great titles that made it worth separating your nunchuck for. However, the other way of holding the Wiimote was by turning the thing on its side, and thanks to its ingenious design, it becomes an instantly recognizable mimic of the NES controller, and with NES games coming to the system through Virtual Console, it made perfect sense to have this kind of thing built into the controller. The problem is, no matter how brilliant your design is, a controller that's comfortable to hold one way can only be so comfortable when you turn it sideways. The NES controller was far from perfect. It was just a rectangle with hard edges, but there was ample space to rest your fingers and the simplicity played to its advantage. Meanwhile, trying to figure out where to rest your fingers on the Wiimote is seemingly impossible, as it had all of the NES's controller's mass compressed into a thin rectangle, and there's buttons spread throughout the entire thing, most of which you can't press comfortably. It's evident from Nintendo's own games that they didn't think the design through very far beyond being a retro throwback, as the warning screens that appear telling you how to hold it aren't even consistent, and depending on the size of your hands, finding an ideal way to hold it can be impossible. It doesn't help that unlike every other controller ever, it's horrifically lopsided thanks to the gigantic bulk where the batteries go, or that the D-pad was nearly as tiny as the D-pad on the GameCube controller that nobody used. But again, the sideways Wiimote was just another option, and for Virtual Console games it worked well enough. The problem comes in when it's not just an option anymore. New Super Mario Bros. Wii is the game that the sideways Wiimote feels like it was made for. The game is supposed to be a modern-day version of the original Super Mario Bros., and tries to keep things nearly as simple, and that also applies to the controls. They're identical to the original, but with the addition of a simple shake that basically acts as a third button. With the sideways Wiimote, it almost feels as if you're still using an NES controller to play a brand new Super Mario Bros. Game nearly 20 years after the last one, and that feeling of nostalgia is absolutely what Nintendo was banking on with this game. However, despite feeling like a match made in heaven, Someone on the development team understood that having options is only a good thing, as they allowed for the game to be controlled using the nunchuck combo. It controls just as well as Sideways Wiimote, albeit with some weird inconsistencies, as the game doesn't expect you to be playing it like that. But nevertheless, it doesn't take anything away from the game, and again is just another option. However, whatever team worked on New Super Mario Bros. U clearly didn't get the memo, as when U launched 3 years after Wii, it forced players to use the Wiimote if they were playing multiplayer, despite the fact that many owners of the Wii U likely only had a Pro controller sitting around, forcing you to buy a Wiimote if you wanted to play this multiplayer-focused game with other players. Luckily, it seems that the memo eventually reached them, as a year after launch when the Luigi U DLC was added, Pro controller support was also added, which is obviously a good thing, just very strange that it took so long. My point, however, is that despite being a franchise that is grounded in the past and afraid to try new things, even New Super Mario Bros. Understands that giving alternative ways to play benefits the game as a whole, and again, is only a good thing. Kirby's Return to Dreamland didn't understand this at all. You could say this is the game that inspired this entire video. Being one of the last major titles released for the Wii, this was one of the last times I had to use a Sideways Wiimote, and it took me this long to realize how much of a problem I have with the control method. And it wasn't a realization of how uncomfortable it was or how stupid it looked, it was a realization that my hands really hurt. I would play Return to Dreamland for about an hour and have to stop as my fingers would start to cramp and trying to press buttons would become a struggle. At first I wrote it off as an isolated incident, but this continued to happen each time I tried playing the game, and thanks to this I never came close to finishing it, which obviously sucks. While you likely didn't have this problem, if a quick Google search is anything to go off of, it was far from an uncommon issue. This is why having multiple controller options is such a big deal, and so widespread today, because certain individuals can't use certain controllers. The GameCube controller is seen by many as the perfect controller for Smash Bros, but at the same time, the controller is infamously bad for your hands. This is why the ability to use a Pro controller with the game is so great, because it works for those who can't use the GameCubes. Competitive players have even gone as far as to design controllers specifically with ergonomics in mind, because accessibility is just that important. For Kirby, a franchise made to be accessible, to restrict the player to one single controller option isn't just baffling, it's also really stupid. While there are many games that require the Wiimote's pointer functionality, the main game just has you shake the thing to activate your Super Suck, and even that is optional, as simply rotating the D-pad accomplishes the same thing. There's no reason why this game couldn't have featured support for Nunchuck, Classic Controller, or even GameCube Controller, and it would have been easy for the developers to remedy this. In fact, it's so easy that fans modded in Classic Controller support only a week after the game's initial debut. I'm ragging on Kirby a lot, but truth be told, there's other games on the system that unreasonably forced Sideways Wiimote, such as Wario Land Shake It, which stands as the last entry to one of my favorite franchises, and a game I've barely played because, you know. Though both of these titles are clear examples of Nintendo demanding you play the game how they see best, and forcing you to experience everything the Wii has to offer, even if you don't want to. Some third-party games outdid Nintendo in this department, and set a much better example, such as the wonderful A Boy and His Blob remake. If you've never heard of it, it's a beautiful 2D side-scroller and one of the better exclusives on the system, just like Wario Land, and unlike Wario, it allows support for the Nunchuck and Classic Controller. The one thing is that A Boy and His Blob doesn't have any part that requires motion controls, but again, Return to Dreamland really doesn't either. There's nothing that Wario Land and Kirby couldn't have accomplished with the Nunchuck attached, as proven by New Super Mario Bros. But, at the very least, to the defense of these two games, these are 2D side-scrollers, and it's easy to see why Nintendo would want you to play games in this genre with a D-pad. But side-scrollers are where the usage of this controller should end. However, Nintendo has proven in the past that they will throw out their previous innovations if it means they could push something new, as shown with how Mario 64 DS was made to show off the capabilities of the DS, while throwing out the control stick that the original was made for. At least in that scenario, you can go back to the original. In fact, you could go back to it on the Wii using the Classic Controller or GameCube controller. But in the case of Super Paper Mario, things aren't so simple. This is a game I consider to be greatly underappreciated and nowadays taken for granted. It's peak Nintendo weirdness and does more ballsy things than Nintendo could ever imagine doing nowadays. Forgetting that it's a Paper Mario game, it's astounding that such a title has the Mario brand associated with it, as the topics it tackles are more brutal than any other game in the entire franchise. It's frankly a miracle this game exists. But despite all that at its core, the game still attempts to replicate the style of the original Super Mario Bros., and I could only imagine that being the main reason as to why they decided to limit the game to being played with a sideways Wiimote. Especially since the game came out years before New Super Mario Bros. Wii showed that they didn't have to do that. Motion controls are few and far between throughout the game, but are just intrusive enough to bog down the experience, having you shake the Wiimote to use an item, or shake the Wiimote to gain extra points, which doesn't even feel like it works properly. More importantly, turning the Wiimote upright and pointing it towards the screen allows you to click on things, to find secrets and learn important details about characters and enemies, which just feels super awkward. There's no reason why this couldn't have been done with the nunchuck combo by letting you hold the B button to activate the cursor. In fact, this could have been done with a GameCube controller. Time freezes, there's nothing at stake, the precision of the pointer is not needed. Thanks to these weird design choices, it's basically impossible to remap the controls digitally to be more comfortable, but that's not even the biggest problem. You see, the 2D segments of Super Paper Mario are only half the game, and the other half is as much of a 3D platformer as Super Mario 3D World is, and yet you have no choice but to play it with a D-pad. This is easily the most imprecise and finicky it has ever felt to move Mario around in a 3D space. You're still expected to do precise platforming despite being given only 8 directions of movement, and the game feels broken because of it. It doesn't help that now that you aren't just pressing left and right anymore, the discomfort of the D-pad really starts to shine through, and starts to wear on your thumb. This game is simply a culmination of everything that could go wrong with the sideways Wiimote. The sad part is, the game originally started development for the GameCube. In fact, that's what I pre-ordered it on before the development shifted to the Wii, and given that Super Paper Mario runs on a barely modified 1000-year door engine, it almost certainly had 360-degree movement and stick sensitivity already implemented before becoming a Wii game. I would say that I wish Nintendo would port or remake the game for modern consoles, but Nintendo seems to be a monkey's paw where anything you wish for has some giant negative, and either way it's the black sheep of a trilogy Nintendo already doesn't like to acknowledge. Until some really dedicated modders manage to find a way to get the game working with a traditional controller, we're stuck with a possible masterpiece of the Mario franchise that's made significantly worse just because of the controller it's tied to. In the past 10 or so years, the only times I've found myself using the sideways Wiimote was for 10 to 15 minute bursts when playing Nintendo Land. And nowadays, Nintendo has gotten a lot smarter when it comes to controllers. The Joy-Cons may not be perfect, in fact they're almost identical in concept to the Wiimote and Nunchuck, but when holding one sideways you now have a joystick instead of a D-pad, so it's instantly better. You're almost never forced to use single Joy-Con either, unless you're playing 1-2 Switch or Mario Party, and in cases like that it makes a lot more sense than when the Wii would force you to do the same. Either way, more than 99% of the time, you can use any controller you want, whether it's a single Joy-Con, paired Joy-Con, Pro Controller, GameCube controller, even a PS4 controller if you have an adapter. Not to mention you can map the buttons on your Switch controller, allowing a level of customization that is ordinarily only seen on PCs. Nintendo has a lot of problems nowadays, and they've become harder and harder to defend. But at the very least, they've seemingly come to terms with letting you play their games with your controller of choice. At least until your Joy-Con starts to drift and you have to buy another one. But that's a story for another day.